We're watching something extraordinary unfold in the Caribbean right now, something that would have been unthinkable just a decade ago. Russian warships have arrived in Venezuelan waters, not for a routine port visit, but as a clear statement of geopolitical intent. This isn't just about military hardware or naval posturing. What we're witnessing is the fundamental restructuring of hemispheric power that the United States has taken for granted since the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. For 2 centuries, Washington has operated under the assumption that the Western Hemisphere is America's exclusive sphere of influence. That assumption is now being directly challenged. Russia's naval presence in Venezuela represents Moscow's answer to decades of NATO expansion eastward, to the placement of missile defense systems along Russia's borders, and to what the Kremlin views as relentless American encroachment. Venezuela, meanwhile, sitting on the world's largest proven oil reserves, has become the focal point of a much larger contest about who sets the rules in global affairs. The sanctions, the diplomatic isolation, the threats of military intervention, none of it has brought about the regime change Washington demanded. Instead, it's pushed Caracas deeper into partnerships with Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran. We need to understand what's really at stake here, because the consequences reach far beyond Caracas or Moscow. This is about whether we're moving toward a multipolar world or clinging to a unipolar order that no longer reflects global realities. Let me take you back to understand how we arrived at this moment, because nothing in geopolitics happens in isolation. The story of Russian warships in Venezuelan waters is really the story of American foreign policy over the past 3 decades, and how that policy has systematically alienated potential partners while driving adversaries into each other's arms. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the United States stood at an unprecedented moment of global dominance. We had won the Cold War, or so the narrative went. American policymakers believed we had reached what Francis Fukuyama famously called the end of history, the final triumph of liberal democracy and market capitalism. But what did we do with that moment? Instead of building a genuine framework for global cooperation, instead of integrating Russia into European security architecture, instead of creating institutions that reflected the interests of all major powers, we chose expansion and dominance. I remember the debates in the 1990 seconds about NATO expansion. There were wise voices warning that pushing NATO eastward would be seen by Russia as a fundamental threat. George Kennan, the architect of America's Cold War containment strategy, called NATO expansion the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. He understood what our political leaders refused to acknowledge, that Russia, regardless of who governed it, would view NATO forces on its borders as an existential threat, but we didn't listen. We expanded NATO first to Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. Then came the Baltic states, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. With each wave of expansion, we told ourselves we were spreading democracy and security, but what we were really doing was building a military alliance right up to Russia's doorstep, while excluding Russia from any meaningful role in European security. The turning point came in 2008 at the NATO summit in Bucharest, when the alliance announced that Ukraine and Georgia would eventually become members. For Russia, this was a red line crossed. Ukraine isn't just another country to Russia. It's the cradle of Russian civilization, the birthplace of the first Russian state in Kiev. The idea of NATO forces in Ukraine, of American missile systems just a few hundred miles from Moscow, was something no Russian government could accept, regardless of its political orientation. And yet we pushed forward, believing that Russia was too weak to respond, that history was on our side, that we could reshape the entire post-Soviet space according to our preferences without consequences. Now you might ask, what does all of this have to do with Venezuela? Everything. Because American foreign policy has followed the same playbook in Latin America that it followed in Eastern Europe. We've assumed that the Western Hemisphere is ours to manage, that governments in this region exist at our pleasure, and that any country that defies Washington must be isolated, sanctioned, and ultimately overthrown. Venezuela's story is particularly instructive. Hugo Chavez came to power in 1999 through democratic elections, winning with a platform of using Venezuela's oil wealth to benefit the poor majority rather than the traditional elite. Whatever you think of Chavez's policies, and there's plenty to criticize, he was democratically elected, but because he challenged American corporate interests, because he used Venezuela's oil revenues for social programs rather than funneling profits to international oil companies, and because he built alliances with Cuba and other countries Washington didn't approve of, he became a target. The United States supported a coup against Chavez in 2002. It failed, but our hostility never wavered. When Nicolas Maduro succeeded Chavez after his death in 2013, Washington intensified the pressure. We've imposed wave after wave of sanctions, not targeted sanctions against specific individuals, but comprehensive economic sanctions designed to strangle the entire Venezuelan economy. These sanctions have blocked Venezuela from accessing international financial markets, prevented the country from selling its oil, frozen billions of dollars in Venezuelan assets, and created a humanitarian catastrophe. The United Nations estimates that tens of thousands of Venezuelans have died as a direct result of these sanctions. Millions have fled the country, creating a refugee crisis throughout Latin America. And what was the justification? Democracy and human rights, we're told. But if we cared about democracy, we wouldn't be partnering with Saudi Arabia, Egypt, or dozens of other authoritarian regimes. The real issue is that Venezuela refused to accept American dominance. This brings us back to Russia's naval presence. When you're a country under siege, when the world's most powerful military is openly discussing regime change, when your economy is being deliberately destroyed by external sanctions, you look for allies wherever you can find them. Venezuela found them in Russia, China, and Iran, other countries that have experienced American pressure and understand the value of standing together. Russia's relationship with Venezuela isn't primarily about ideology, it's about geopolitics and mutual interest. Russia gains a foothold in the Western Hemisphere, a way to demonstrate that it can project power beyond its immediate neighborhood. Venezuela gains a powerful partner that can provide military equipment, technical expertise, investment, and most importantly, a deterrent against American intervention. The Russian naval deployments to Venezuela have been happening periodically since 2008, but they've taken on new significance in recent years as tensions between Russia and the West have intensified. These aren't just symbolic visits. Russian military advisors are in Venezuela. Russian equipment, from air defense systems to fighter jets, has been delivered. Russian oil companies have invested in Venezuelan energy infrastructure. There are reports of Russian personnel at Venezuelan military bases. Moscow is sending a clear message to Washington. If you can put military infrastructure on our borders, we can establish a presence in your hemisphere. If you can support governments we consider hostile, we can protect governments you're trying to overthrow. And here's what makes this situation so dangerous. It's completely unnecessary. The crisis in Venezuela, the Russian presence there, the broader deterioration of hemispheric relations, all of it stems from American policies that have consistently prioritized dominance over diplomacy. Think about what a different approach might have looked like. When Chavez was elected, we could have engaged with his government, worked with Venezuela on mutually beneficial energy partnerships, and supported constructive reforms while voicing concerns about problematic policies. Instead, we supported a coup and then spent 2 decades trying to strangle the country economically. When the Soviet Union collapsed, we could have genuinely integrated Russia into European and global institutions, creating a security architecture that included rather than excluded Moscow. Instead, we expanded NATO and treated Russia as a defeated enemy rather than a potential partner. The pattern repeats itself across the globe. In Iraq, we invaded based on false claims about weapons of mass destruction, destroyed the country's infrastructure, caused hundreds of thousands of deaths, and created the conditions for ISIS to emerge. In Libya, we supported regime change that turned a functioning state, however imperfect, into a failed state with open slave markets. In Syria, we armed rebel groups that included extremist elements, prolonging a civil war that has killed 500,000 people. In Afghanistan, we spent 20 years and trillions of dollars trying to impose our vision of governance, only to see the Taliban return to power. In each case, we told ourselves we were promoting democracy and human rights. In each case, we made the situation worse. And in each case, we refused to acknowledge the limitations of military power and the importance of respecting other nations' sovereignty. The Venezuelan situation is particularly tragic because there was always a diplomatic path forward. Venezuela has massive oil reserves, the largest in the world. The United States is the natural market for that oil. Venezuela needs technology, investment, and access to international markets. These are the ingredients for a mutually beneficial relationship. But instead of engagement, we chose confrontation. Instead of negotiation, we chose sanctions. Instead of diplomacy, we chose regime change operations. And now we act surprised when Venezuela turns to Russia and China for the partnerships we refuse to offer. Let's talk about what these sanctions actually mean on the ground, because I think many Americans don't fully understand the impact. When we sanction a country's oil sector, we're not just punishing the government, we're punishing every person in that country. Venezuela's economy has contracted by more than 75% since the sanctions intensified. Inflation has reached unimaginable levels. Hospitals lack basic medicines. The electrical grid frequently fails. Food shortages are common. People are dying from treatable diseases because the healthcare system has collapsed. Millions have fled not because of socialism or Maduro's policies alone, but because American sanctions made it impossible for the country to function economically. And we did this deliberately, with full knowledge of the humanitarian consequences. John Bolton, when he was National Security Advisor, openly stated that the goal was to make the Venezuelan economy scream to create the conditions for regime change. Think about that. A senior American official bragging about creating economic suffering for millions of people to achieve a political goal. This is not how democracy should conduct foreign policy. This is not consistent with American values or international law. The United Nations Charter prohibits the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. It requires respect for sovereignty and non-interference in internal affairs. But we've convinced ourselves that these rules don't apply to us, that American exceptionalism means we're exempt from the constraints that govern other nations. We call it promoting democracy. The rest of the world sees it as imperialism under a different name. And when Russia or China acts in ways we consider aggressive, when they support governments we oppose, when they establish military presences in regions we consider our sphere of influence, we express outrage and disbelief. But from their perspective, they're simply doing what we've been doing for decades, pursuing their national interests and supporting their allies. The double standards are staggering. We maintain nearly 800 military bases in more than 70 countries around the world. Our naval forces patrol every ocean. Our military spending exceeds that of the next 10 countries combined. We've been at war almost continuously for the past quarter century. We conduct drone strikes in countries we're not at war with. We overthrow governments we don't like. We arm rebels and support opposition movements globally. But when Russia establishes a military relationship with Venezuela, when China builds ports and infrastructure in developing countries, when Iran has influence in neighboring states, we call it aggression and threaten consequences. The hypocrisy is not lost on the rest of the world, even if it's invisible to many Americans. And this gets to something fundamental about how we see ourselves versus how others see us. Americans generally believe our country is a force for good in the world, that our military interventions are humanitarian, that our economic policies promote development, and that our political influence spreads democracy. This isn't entirely false. American aid has saved lives. American technology has advanced human progress. American ideals of freedom and equality have inspired movements worldwide. But it's also incomplete and self-serving. For every country we've helped, there's another where American intervention has caused chaos. For every successful democracy we've supported, there's an authoritarian regime we've propped up because it served our interests. For every humanitarian mission, there's been a war of choice that killed thousands and solved nothing. The people of Latin America know this history intimately. They remember the coups we supported in Guatemala, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, and elsewhere. They remember the death squads we trained. They remember the dictatorships we backed as long as they were anti-communist or pro-American business interests. They remember that when their countries elected left-wing governments, even democratic ones, we worked to undermine and overthrow them. So, when we say we're concerned about democracy in Venezuela, they're skeptical, and rightfully so. Our concern for democracy has always been selective, applied only when it serves American interests, and ignored when those interests point elsewhere. This is why Russian ships in Venezuelan waters should worry us. Not because Russia is inherently evil or expansionist, but because their presence there is a symptom of our failed policies. It's a symptom of a foreign policy that creates adversaries unnecessarily, that sees every issue as a zero-sum contest, that refuses to accept a world where American power is not absolute. The world is changing. Economic power is shifting eastward. New powers are rising. The unipolar moment that followed the Cold War was brief and is now over. We're entering a multipolar world, whether we like it or not. The question is whether we'll adapt to this reality through diplomacy and cooperation, or whether we'll try to maintain dominance through military force and economic coercion, risking conflict and chaos in the process. I look at Venezuela and I see a microcosm of these larger failures. A country with immense natural wealth reduced to poverty and dysfunction through a combination of domestic mismanagement and external pressure. A population suffering not because change is impossible, but because the path to change has been blocked by sanctions and intervention. A government that has become more authoritarian in part because it's under siege. Because governments rarely become more democratic when they're fighting for survival against external threats. And now foreign powers are establishing a military presence, turning Venezuela into a potential flashpoint for great power conflict. All because we couldn't accept that a country in our hemisphere might choose a path we didn't approve of. The solution isn't complicated, but it requires something American foreign policy has lacked for decades: humility. We need to acknowledge that regime change operations don't work, that sanctions harm ordinary people more than governments, and that military intervention creates more problems than it solves. We need to lift the sanctions on Venezuela and allow the country to recover economically. We need to engage diplomatically with the Maduro government, working toward elections and political reforms through negotiation rather than coercion. We need to respect Venezuela's sovereignty and accept that Venezuelans, not Americans, should determine their country's future. And we need to do this not just for Venezuela, but as part of a broader shift in how we engage with the world. This means talking to Russia about security guarantees that address their legitimate concerns while protecting the sovereignty of neighboring states. It means working with China on global challenges like climate change rather than treating them purely as a strategic competitor. It means ending the forever wars that have consumed American blood and treasure while making us less safe. It means rebuilding international institutions and accepting that in a multipolar world we'll need to compromise and cooperate rather than dictate and dominate. It means understanding that stability and peace come from addressing the legitimate grievances and interests of all parties, not from imposing our will through force. None of this means abandoning American values or interests. It means pursuing them more wisely. A Venezuela that can sell its oil and trade freely is a Venezuela that's more stable, more prosperous, and ultimately more democratic than a Venezuela under siege. A Russia that's integrated into European security architecture is a Russia that's less threatening than one that's excluded and antagonized. A China that's invested in global institutions is a China that has incentives to play by international rules. A United States that leads through example and cooperation is more influential than one that leads through threats and coercion. But we're going in the opposite direction. We're militarizing our competition with China. We're fighting a proxy war with Russia and Ukraine. We're maintaining sanctions on a third of humanity. We're spending more on our military than ever before, while our infrastructure crumbles and our social problems multiply. And we're doing all of this while telling ourselves we have no choice, that we're defending democracy and freedom, that our adversaries forced us into these positions. It's not true. We have choices. We've always had choices. We've simply made bad ones repeatedly because our foreign policy establishment is trapped in outdated thinking that sees the world through the lens of dominance and control rather than cooperation and mutual interest. The Russian Navy in Venezuela is a warning sign. It tells us that our approach isn't working, that other powers are finding ways to counter American pressure, and that the costs of our interventionist policies are mounting. We can heed that warning and change course, or we can double down and risk escalating conflicts that serve no one's interest. The choice is ours, But we need to make it consciously and honestly, without the self-deception that has characterized American foreign policy for too long. The world is not ours to control. Other nations have legitimate interests and grievances. Military power has limits. And in an interconnected world facing common challenges from climate change to pandemic disease to economic instability, cooperation isn't just morally right, it's practically necessary. That's the lesson of Russian ships in Venezuelan waters, if we're willing to learn it. The question is whether we